Hi. If you have a fear of flying, or maybe you just want to understand flight operations a little bit better, then this is the place for you. In this video, I'm going to describe 5 things that, as a professional test pilot, don't bother me about flying, and why they shouldn't bother you either. Welcome back to Travel Tips. I'm a professional pilot and have been for 30 years, first in the Navy and then as a test pilot. Being a test pilot gives me knowledge of how an airplane is designed, tested, and how pilots are trained in aircraft operations. So this knowledge gives me confidence about airline travel, and I'm going to share this information with you. I'm also going to discuss what you can expect in a few different emergency scenarios. After all, knowledge is 9/10 of the law, or something like that. So in this video, I'm going to cover 5 common fears that travelers have. Let's get started. Before we do, though, I want to point out how impressive the airliner's safety record is. This record has been achieved through continual improvements in design, testing, and operations, and these improvements will continue. Now let's really jump into it and cover the first fear, which is an engine failure during flight. First of all, the airplane is fully capable of flying with one engine failed, but the most critical time for this to happen would be on takeoff. Not because of performance. In fact, every takeoff is planned assuming an engine is going to fail, and to make sure you have enough runway and climb capability. It is critical because the procedures that the pilots apply at this point is most critical at this stage. But pilots train extensively for this scenario. If this were to happen on a plane you were on, this is what you could expect. First of all, the airplane wouldn't accelerate as quickly as normal, and it also wouldn't climb as much as usual due to the less thrust available. If it happens while at altitude, then the airplane might not have enough power or thrust to stay at a high altitude, and the pilots might need to descend to an intermediate altitude. But in this case, you can expect that the descent will be pretty gradual and normal. And just like takeoffs, the pilots train extensively for handling an engine failure during landing. So if this happens, everything's going to feel pretty normal. You might not even realize the engine has failed. Let's move on to the second fear a lot of people ask about, which is turbulence. Turbulence is a natural phenomenon, just like waves in the water, which is interesting because I've never seen anybody in a boat be concerned about waves. I think the reason for this is when you're in a boat, about 90% of the time you're probably in waves and rocking. But in an airplane, probably 90% of the time it's smooth. So when you do get that turbulence, it feels unusual. But rest assured it's not. It's a natural phenomenon. There are 4 different causes of turbulence, which then result in different types of turbulence. But in this case, I want to group it into just 2 categories. The first is turbulence that you expect. So it's pretty typical or easy to understand that when there's heavy clouds or on takeoff when it's been really windy or storms are in the area, that you're going to have turbulence. That's pretty much expected by everybody. The second category is turbulence that you don't expect, and we generally call this clear air turbulence. In other words, there's no clouds in sight, everything's pretty smooth, and all of a sudden you get some bumps. And this is generally caused by traveling through various air masses like weather fronts or the jet stream. I can tell you pilots are extremely aware that passengers don't like turbulence, and they'll do everything they can to avoid it. This might include maneuvering to avoid clouds or weather, or in a case of clear air turbulence, they may climb or descend to get out of the turbulence. And they may even change speed to minimize the impact of the turbulence to the passengers. But in many cases, it's just impossible to avoid the turbulence altogether. So here's some things to keep in mind. First, the airplane is structurally designed for that turbulence. It's designed for the worst case, not the best. And then on top of that, there are safety factors applied. So even if the airplane were to experience turbulence that's beyond what was expected, the airplane's going to be fine. So while you might not like turbulence, there's really no reason to fear it. It's an expected natural phenomenon which the plane has been fully designed to handle. The next fear I want to cover is bad weather. You might be surprised to learn that understanding weather patterns, current weather, and predicted weather is a big part of being a pilot. And understanding weather is introduced in the earliest stages of flight training. Most people will get their weather from TV or from websites that give just a very general outlook about the weather. But there are actually many products designed specifically for aviation. And these products provide much more detailed information. And the pilots reviewed this weather prediction information prior to every flight. Before takeoff, the pilots have reviewed all weather information available and planned a route to avoid the weather by safe levels. And they've loaded enough fuel on board to fly this specific route to the destination, and in some cases even an alternate airport. Even en route, weather information can be accessed in flight. On top of that, the airplanes have a weather radar in the nose, which shows the weather intensity ahead in real time. And the pilots can use this information to adjust their route based on the actual weather that's occurring. Next, I want to cover another fear a lot of people ask me about, and that's somebody opening the door in flight. Doors are designed to be opened on the ground for either normal exit or emergency exit. But these doors can't physically be opened during flight, even though there's no lock on the doors. And why is that? Well, during flight, the airplane is pressurized to provide a normal environment for the passengers and crew. Also, the doors are plug type doors. And what does that mean? Well, the door itself is actually bigger than the opening it sits in. So that pressure is holding the door, and due to the amount of pressurization, it would literally take thousands of pounds to open a door. It's just physically impossible. But during descent, the airplane is depressurized, and on landing, the doors are able to once again easily be opened to egress the airplane. So if you see someone try to open a door, don't panic. They just physically can't do it. Obviously, this is a serious situation because of the intentions of that person, and they're likely to find themselves duct taped back to their seat. Next, let's talk about loss of pressurization during flight. Well, first, how does this happen? Well, it can happen due to a failure in the pressurization system, or it can be due to an anomaly in the aircraft, which causes a leak and allows for air to escape the aircraft quicker than the pressurization system can supply it. And this is a critical failure because the pilots and crew and passengers can't survive very long at altitude when the aircraft isn't pressurized. But the good news is this isn't a problem once the airplane descends to a lower altitude. If this happens, it's definitely going to be startling to most passengers. So let's talk through what happens and why the airplane and you are going to be just fine. If the airplane partially or fully depressurizes in flight, you're going to feel it in your ears, and the oxygen masks are going to drop. The masks are designed to drop automatically if the cabin altitude reaches about 14,000 feet. Now, those oxygen masks aren't connected to a big tank of air for everyone. They're actually connected to an oxygen generator. And this is why the crew tells you if the masks come out to tug on the mask before you put it on. When you tug on it, that's actually activating that oxygen generator. And from there, the oxygen generator will supply about 10 to 15 minutes of oxygen. And as a side note, the pilots do have a separate supply of oxygen, which will supply them for a much longer time. And the reason for this is there might be other times the pilots need to use oxygen when the passengers wouldn't, including sometimes during normal operations. And at this point, the pilots need to get the airplane down to a lower altitude where the environment supplies enough oxygen for everybody, and they need to do it quickly because there's a limited supply of oxygen for the passengers at this time. So at this point, you can expect the airplane to start descending, and it would be much more rapid than normal. But don't worry, the descent is fully controlled, and the pilots practice this procedure all the time. Once down to a safe altitude, the descent rates from there through landing would be much more normal. So that's it. Not a fun condition, but one that's fully controllable using the equipment that's already on board and the pilot's procedures. I want to leave you with this one additional thought. One reason airlines are the safest mode of transportation is there's safety factors built into everything. I talked about some of the design safety margins, but did you know there's also safety margins built into operations? As an example, let's say an airplane needs 4,000 feet of runway to land. Well, the pilots are required to use the runway actually longer than this to provide additional safety margins. And every aspect of aviation is like this. Why do you think there's 2 pilots on board? I plan on releasing a second video with 5 additional fears I don't have, and I'll release it in a couple of weeks, so be sure to check back for that. Of course, you can always subscribe to get notifications about new content. And hit me up in the comments if you have any additional questions or maybe advice. Thanks for watching, and check out this additional video with more travel advice or inspiration.